Okay, we are started. There might be some angry Twitter people who were told that this would begin at 9 o'clock and it's now 9:40, but too bad. Too bad.
My
That's what I have
fault.
to say. Cry about it. That's my go-to Twitter repost lately. Cry about it. Okay, I'm tweeting it out. There we go.
I have silenced myself. Silenced. I'm just made up a word.
Okay. That's not silence. No, people use that all the time, right?
I said silented.
Okay. A little less graceful than silenced.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I wanted to just start with as a basis for the discussion or a starting point is I remember on the day before the U.S. election, you tweeted out something that was pretty amazing, and I went back and just tonight went to go look at it. This quote: I've been asking Syrians who they want to win for president. The vast majority say Trump because they feel he's less likely to bomb them. Okay, so that was an instant retweet for me when I saw it, just because it definitely countervails many assumptions that you would see in the domestic U.S. media. So maybe just describe a little bit about what led you to that conclusion. What were people saying that brought about that tweet?
So to be clear, I was in areas that were under the control of the government and Syria, which is the majority of areas, and this was mostly in Damascus, and I just in the week leading up to the election, I was in Syria, and so it was a topic of conversation because the presidential election in the U.S. is something that the whole world watches, and so this is something that I constantly was talking to people about, and the vast majority of people I spoke to, and of course this is completely anecdotal, but it makes sense. Their response to who do you want to win was, well, Trump will be bad for Americans, but for us, we think he's better. And I'd ask why, and that was the common response was Hillary Clinton's gonna bomb us, and Trump might bomb us, but he also might not. He's less likely to, and so that was the common response that I got. And I also everybody also was saying that operating under the assumption that Hillary Clinton was going to win too, because even international news headlines had her in the lead. So I don't know if that
they were also sitting around refreshing 538. Huh?
Well, no, it's just if anybody is talking about, you have to understand that the presidential election, it really does it's an international headline in the U.S. And everybody assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win, even abroad. There was a couple people who were just be careful, Trump might win. But most people assumed it was going to be Hillary Clinton. The world really wasn't shocked that Donald Trump won. Nobody was expecting it, not just in the U.S., abroad as well.
Yeah. So, obviously this is anecdotal, but you can only go off your anecdotal experience. That's what I hate, this meme going around. People will say, oh, that's just anecdotal evidence or your anecdotal experience. Well, anecdotal evidence is called reporting.
Yeah.
So obviously it's going to be anecdotal if it's you going around to a non-random subset of interviewees and gauging their sentiments. That's just a fallacy, and it annoys me. But based on the people that you did anecdotally speak to, were these generally people who had? I guess the way that I've seen described a predominant feeling among Syrians, and obviously it's a very disparate group of people and diverse, but a lot of people seem to be reluctantly resigned to the Assad government, not because they're necessarily supportive, but because they view it as superior to the alternative of jihadist rule. Was that the basic nature of the people you were speaking to, or what was their sort of How would you characterize
Yeah,
their beliefs?
I would describe it, I mean, it was very diverse. I would actually describe it as there's outright support for the government. There's people who genuinely do support the government, like in a way that I wouldn't agree with, but they live there, not me. But they really do support the government. And there's other people who will admit the government's corrupt. But yeah, there is a lot of people, that's how their belief is like, regardless of how shitty the Syrian government is, the alternative is completely unacceptable. And it's understandable why. If you look at the alternative right now, and people want to pretend like there's some fantastical middle ground, secular armed opposition, but there's just not. There's a bunch of different, there's jihadist groups, and there's a spectrum that they're on. I mean, some of them are more fanatical than others, but at the end of the day, they're misogynist, they're sectarian, and they want to impose a system of laws that people don't want to live under. And it's one thing if you're here's the thing that I keep getting really frustrated with is, especially today, someone on Twitter was like, you're an Islamophobe because you don't like these jihadist groups, or you're calling all of them jihadists. And I'm like, hold on a second. We're not talking about Oklahoma. It's like when people, when lawmakers in Oklahoma, right-wing lawmakers, are pissed off about Sharia laws coming to take over Oklahoma, that's Islamophobic. There's no one's trying to impose Sharia law in Oklahoma, right? But when you're
they're confabulating a threat. I mean, there's no realistic threat of an Islamic takeover of Oklahoma, so that's just nonsense. But why
isn't this coming through to here?
It's empirical, right?
Yeah. Hang on a second. Something's not right with this. Are you hearing an echo at all?
No.
Oh, hold on.
It's fine on my end.
Sound is coming out of the wrong place. Hold on. How about now?
Okay.
Huh. Hang on a second.
I still hear you fine.
Okay, just 1 second. I have to fix the
They can wait. Let them wait.
Yeah, sorry guys. I was making a good point too.
Don't apologize to them. They should be, on their knees giving thanks to us.
Right. Hang on a second.
You just muted yourself.
You're right.
So
sorry.
I can't hear you right now.
I didn't mute myself. I'm back though. I'm back.
Okay, you're back. You're back.
I'm trying to fix the hang on. Yes. Okay. What about now?
You're still good for me.
Okay, cool. Sweet. So anyways, as I was saying, it's one thing if you've got people in Oklahoma, lawmakers who are passing laws against Sharia, right? That's Islamophobic. Nobody's trying to impose Sharia law on you. But you know what? When you're in a place like Syria or in the Middle East, and there are actual groups that are trying to impose these trying to impose a style of Taliban rule, then that is a serious threat, and it's not Islamophobic to oppose that. And I actually find that to be a really offensive talking point, because you're basically by default you're conflating Muslims and Islam with jihadists. If it becomes Islamophobic to oppose violent jihadist rule, but that's what people are living with over there. And I just keep hearing people calling it see all these Syrians in government areas who don't want to live under the armed opposition are Islamophobes or something. And the funny thing is, the vast majority of Syrians, whether it's in Damascus or Aleppo in the government areas, vast majority of them are Muslim or Sunni Muslims. They just happen to be on the more secular end of it. Or they just, even if they're religious and devout, they are not interested in living under lawless groups that behave like criminal gangs, and enforce really disgusting laws, and really backwards laws. And so that's the situation people are stuck between. I mean, one person in particular that I was talking to in Aleppo actually put it to me this way. He told me, we're trapped between a police state and Al-Qaeda, and I choose the police state. And that makes sense to me. And even if it doesn't make sense to you, there are Syrians that feel that way, and their voices are completely invisible and erased from the U.S. media. The U.S. media just wants to focus on, activists, and I put that in big quotes, activists in East Aleppo, and these places where the rebels are in charge. And it's like a lot of these activists, like I don't even know what kind of activist you can be in a place that's controlled by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. I mean, they don't really allow activism. And
they're doubly erased now because those people are aligned with the interests of Assad, supposedly. And who is Assad aligned with? Putin. And Putin is the grand evil, avatar now in U.S. politics. And now there's sort of a partisan incentive to even not, broadcast the views of those people that you just described.
Well, the vast majority, that's another thing, is like 70 to 80% of Syrians live in government areas. And in Aleppo specifically, it was like 1.5 million Syrians living in the government-held western side. And they were saying 250,000 to 300,000 people were living in East Aleppo, but that was actually like a way overestimate, like a huge overestimate. That's actually kind of scandalous that it kept being repeated because the source of that was the Al-Qaeda groups that were in charge in East Aleppo. And it ended up being, I mean, from what I'm hearing, anywhere between the government's inflating the number apparently to 100,000, but from my own sources, I keep hearing between 30 to 50,000 people were actually in East Aleppo. And it's not to say that all of them are fighters or combatants, but you had a situation where the entire U.S. media has been talking about bombing West Aleppo to save East Aleppo. Well, West Aleppo has 1.5 million people in it. East Aleppo had maybe 50,000. Like, and I mean, just the hysteria, a lot of that, I mean, I really do, a lot of the hysteria we've been hearing in the media about Aleppo in the past 2 weeks has just been so insane, especially when you look at Mosul, which is a similar operation is happening in Mosul right now at the same time, where you've got the U.S. Doing airstrikes, working with ground forces, Iraqi ground forces, trying to rout out ISIS from Mosul and really using the same tactics that Russia and the Syrian army were using. The only difference is...
And causing confirmed civilian casualties in Mosul, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, we don't hear about that. And one of the reasons is because the ISIS is in charge in Mosul. In East Aleppo, it's these Al-Qaeda groups. And let me just be clear, by the way, about the people in charge in East Aleppo, because that's another thing that's been disgustingly scandalous about the coverage in the past 2 weeks, is suddenly the media went from being a little bit more clear about who's in charge in East Aleppo to just calling them Syrian rebels. Like, there was no context behind any of the coverage of who is in charge in East Aleppo for the past 2 weeks, that Aleppo's been a major headline. It's just Syrian rebels. And the idea of rebels sounds so cute, like rebels are great, like rebels, it's like a positive term. No, like there's actually like
it's you can play like a rebel game with your Lego set, like the rebel Legos versus like the Emperor Legos or something.
Yeah, like you get a tattoo and you're like a rebel or something. Like, you're just like a dissenter.
Yeah, rebel without a cause, James Dean.
Yeah, like let's sing some rock songs. But in reality, I mean, Amnesty International actually did a really good report on this a few months ago that was completely ignored, on the groups that control Aleppo, like East Aleppo and Idlib, which is Idlib governorate, which is like an area of Syria that is controlled by the armed groups. And basically, I mean, some of these rebel groups have banned music. They stone people. They've beheaded people. They torture and sometimes summarily execute people for crimes like criticizing them on social media. And so that's why it's like when you've got CNN and like the New York Times and the Washington Post referring to sources as rebel activists or like Syrian activists in East Aleppo, it's like, dude, all of the information coming out of East Aleppo is controlled by these armed groups that like ban music and summarily execute people. And are shooting at people. They don't let them leave. It's like they've painted a completely different reality based on these accounts from people who are activists who like literally were like they're insurgent activists. And beyond that, it's like the reason that that journalists are forced to rely on rebel activists is because journalists cannot enter East Aleppo. If they do, they'll be kidnapped, ransomed, and probably executed at some point. And so,
can you just sort of sketch out the geography of the situation? I mean, so you were able to enter West Aleppo, correct? And what is the barrier look like between West Aleppo and East Aleppo for people who haven't had the opportunity to visit, which I'm assuming is the vast majority of people watching now. I mean, so like, what is the just the geographic divide between those two areas?
Well, so just to be clear, like it's basically East Aleppo has been taken back by the government. But when I was there, the front line was the old city, which was sort of like in the middle. And that was like the front line where, I mean, there are people like East Aleppo, it's just like the dividing line is just neighborhoods that had been taken over by the insurgents. There wasn't really like a specific dividing line. Like, it's not like the Aleppo's just split into two in general, you know? So it was just kind of like the rebels were able to invade from like the northeast because they came through Turkey, and a lot of them came from the countryside back in 2012, which is another, by the way, I just want to point out another common misconception. Aleppo didn't have an uprising. Like, it was fairly pro-government, very, very pro-government. So much so that like in 2011, as the rest of the country there was like some protests here. There was protests across the rest of the country. There was very few in Aleppo. And then in 2012, the rebel groups that had formed, that had become armed, basically invaded various neighborhoods in East Aleppo because that was the most easily accessible. And there were some of those neighborhoods that were sympathetic to their cause. They basically came and invaded neighborhood by neighborhood, and the government was so busy fighting fighting back this insurgency in the rest of the country that they weren't really there. And so it was really easy for these like armed dudes to just come in and like take over. And a lot of people fled when that happened because they were really scared. You have a bunch of armed men just like coming into your neighborhood that aren't from there. That's what happened in Aleppo, but you don't hear that at all. A lot of people fled. The people that stayed were people who were poorer and just had nowhere to go. Or maybe some people were sympathetic and wanted to stay. But as time went on, it basically took neighborhood after neighborhood. They actually encircled all of Aleppo, including the government-held areas, and besieged them for a while. And back then, Hillary Clinton was cheering them on. All of the U.S. politicians were like hoping that these rebels could insert themselves and make like Aleppo like a headquarters where they could launch more attacks against the government. Meanwhile, the people on the ground they cut off the water, they cut off access to food. And that's what people will tell you in Aleppo if you ask them. And people also, not just inside, people who've left Aleppo, because a lot of people did leave when all this started if they could. Like, it's like, I mean, when your neighborhood gets taken over by armed people, you just get the hell out, you know? And that's actually a common story you hear from a lot of refugees in Lebanon is like, there was fighting in my neighborhood, so I left. But anyways, but that's the dividing line, is just the neighborhoods that are controlled. And there's always this tit for tat going on because the rebels were really well armed through Turkey by the US, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So they were able to maintain a stronghold in East Aleppo. And it was like one neighborhood, and like finally the government like pushed back, and they pushed back like really viciously. I mean, they bombed everything. You see footage of what East Aleppo looks like, and it's just complete rubble. So yeah, it's true. Like, nothing has gone untouched really in East Aleppo. And it's like, I'm not excusing any of that, but that all of that context gets left out, completely left out. And there is a lot of support for the government. And there's another common like misconception too, which is you keep hearing the word genocide being thrown around about not just what's happening in Aleppo, but what's happening in Syria, that this Alawite government, is just running around killing Sunnis. And, I put this talking point to people that are in Syria, that are in Damascus and in Aleppo. And I'm sorry?
I just said, to call it a genocide, I mean, that's just a category error, right? I mean, it might be bad, or it might be excessive, or there might be aspects of it that are worth condemning, but to call it genocide doesn't seem accurate. Anyway, go on. Well,
I mean, it's like you think of the term genocide and you're trying to wipe out a particular group. And in this case, you keep hearing genocide, and this is very sectarian language, actually, that the U.S. and the U.S. media is playing into, which is like Al-Qaeda's rhetoric, which is there's a genocide against Sunni Muslims. And the problem with that talking point is that the vast majority of people who live in the government areas are Sunni Muslims, because the vast majority of Syria are Sunni Muslims. The people who are in the army, the majority of them are Sunni Muslims. The people who are fighting and dying fighting these rebel groups, which is whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or groups that are linked to those groups. And so just as it doesn't work, and I would put that to people and they'd always laugh at me. Like I always got laughed at when I said this because they're like, we're Sunni. Like, I don't know what genocide you're talking about. So it's just like, it makes a mockery of the actual word genocide. I mean, you can say that there's been atrocities committed. You can talk about massacres, but to say it's a genocide makes no sense, especially.
It's another sort of callous misappropriation of terminology. So in the same way that Islamophobia is being, the notion of Islamophobia is being deployed to, to this end, like you mentioned before. I mean, genocide, that's a really fraught term. It's obviously going to engender some stark emotional responses in people. But if a certain segment of Sunni Muslims are being targeted because of their political orientation or because they are trying to achieve a certain political objective, I mean, targeting those people isn't genocidal. I mean, maybe
there
it's bad in some respects.
There's a lot of Sunnis being killed in these cities, like whether it's Aleppo, or whether it's Mosul, or whether it's Fallujah. There are a lot of Sunnis being killed, but it's not because they're Sunni.
Right.
Like, it's because they live in areas that have been taken over. I mean, it's because they live in areas that have been taken over by jihadist groups, and whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Harar al-Sham or like a number of other groups. And this is what counterinsurgency looks like. And that's something that's completely debatable, and I don't agree with it. I don't agree with like carpet bombing these places. I don't. But that's the fact. I mean, we can argue about that. That's a different debate to have, though, than whether this isn't, whether or not it's genocide. But beyond that, it's just the situation in Syria. Like, there's also this network of propagandists who've been. I mean, there's propaganda apparatus. There's a propaganda apparatus like I've never seen before. It's very sophisticated, and it's been funded entirely by the UK and the US and some Gulf states. And I had an article out about this where, like, a journalist colleague of mine got offered $17,000 a month to write pro-rebel propaganda from Turkey, like to move to Turkey and write. And this, you can go read it at Alternate, which is, I mean, it's amazing how, like, it's also, it's another thing. It's like, I'm on the ground in Syria and I've on the ground reporting, and you'd be shocked how few outlets are interested in on the ground reporting from government areas. They don't care. Like, they don't care about those people. And it's just utterly shocking and disgusting. I mean, we've launched, what the US has done, during Iraq, at least we knew what Bush did during Iraq because the US invaded Iraq. With Syria, the US government under Obama has spent $1 billion a year since at least 2013 arming and training jihadist groups to overthrow the Syrian government. So, like, we basically, outsourced an invasion of Syria to Al-Qaeda. Like, that is what happened in Syria. And nobody
carried out a lot of it. I mean, the CIA, was involved, and so was the Pentagon, and they were, in some cases, even arming rival factions that ended up using the weaponry they were given to fight one another. I mean, it's like almost like the talk about Kafkaesque or just the absurdism. But you mentioned that the people generally are in support of the regime prevailing here. Does that mean that they are, by extension, in support of Russia's intervention, or what was your what did you hear on that?
There wasn't only one opinion about that. I would hear,
right.
Some people do support Russia's intervention. It's people who are more pro-government, like they really do support the government. Other people, one common phrase I would hear is that they're using us like toys, like it's just a fight between the US and Russia and we're just like toys in their game, or like chess pieces or something. So there's like, that's like a more, another way to look at it. But for the most part, like, they want the government to win. I talked to people who were a part of the uprising in 2011, like they protested in 2011, and they also want the government to win. Because, like, it's like the government losing means one thing, and that's like, it's the alternative. It's unacceptable. Like, and also,
that's a real punch in the gut, right? And if people who actually spearheaded the initial uprising in 2011 now see the alternative as so desperately unacceptable that they're willing to back Assad, that should really be indication to people in the U.S. that there's a severe shift in opinion there.
Yeah, and it's like, it makes it, but it makes sense, and like it makes complete sense. It's like, if your choices at this point in time, this is not 2011 anymore. If your choices are between the Taliban and stability. Like if you're like a democratic minded person who wants reform, which of those systems is going to give you more of an opportunity to push for reform? It's certainly not going to be under the Taliban, you know, and that, like a Taliban style system. And it's not even just a Taliban style system. It's also just pure lawlessness. Like even in areas that weren't necessarily taken over by Al-Qaeda, when you had the rebel groups take over, like it was chaos and lawlessness. It became like every man for himself. You know, you couldn't walk in the street in Aleppo, for example, back in 2012 and 2013. You couldn't walk in the street without getting robbed. You know, like it's not an environment that's conducive towards like democratic reform. It's more like just a bunch of warlords take over the various areas that they're in charge of.
And robbed by just petty criminals, right? Not necessarily anybody with a political motive.
Well, I mean, yeah, like it was like also people were kidnapped, like business people were kidnapped and ransomed, and like their families would get a phone call being like, you have to pay me 20,000 USD to get your dad back. You know, like things like that happened. So it was kind of like, I mean, so it was like, this is what Hillary claimed. It's really shocking. You go back and look at the coverage in 2012, because a lot of the coverage in 2012 when East Aleppo was first taken over by rebels, because the journalists were actually on the ground to witness what was happening. It's a lot more honest about who these rebels were and what they were doing and what they were saying. But then, you know, that was like right before people started getting kidnapped and sold to ISIS. And back then, even as that's happening, you hear US politicians, including, I mean, Hillary Clinton, I think was still Secretary of State at the time. And she's saying they're cheering these people on. They were cheering like an invasion of this city and a collapse of this city to like be, you know, they wanted the city to be taken over by these like, by this patchwork of like armed groups, like armed criminal gangs that ultimately like ended up giving way to Al-Qaeda. So it's really shocking. And then you just see the coverage now. And even now it's like people in West Aleppo were celebrating. They were celebrating, like, just like you see, like when ISIS is kicked out of a city, whenever ISIS is kicked out of the city, despite the horrors that have taken place, despite the US airstrikes that have likely killed a lot of civilians, people celebrate. They celebrate ISIS being kicked out. And that is what you saw in West Aleppo, is people were celebrating Al-Qaeda being kicked out of their city. Whether they, and like, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all outside. You know, it's like they just are happy Al-Qaeda's out of their city.
Yeah, I mean, and this point really needs to be emphasized, because if you were just a casual news consumer over the past 2 weeks, and you saw CNN headlines, or you saw, you know, a basic news sort of segment on what was going on in Syria, you would have got the impression that there was this genocidal, vicious assault on just a totally civilian population, and the world community was just idly sitting by and letting it go on. You would have no sense whatsoever that there were elements of the populace who would be out celebrating. So that was just totally absent, and you have to wonder: is that intentional? To what degree is that intentional on the part of people who were in charge of presenting the news to Americans, and to what degree is it the result of some kind of concerted propagandistic campaign?
It's both. I think that journalists have, especially after being around some of them, they've really convinced themselves of a certain narrative to the point where that's just what that's how they're gonna portray it. It's also like, this is the narrative of the US government. And so our media tends to report things through the lens of what the Pentagon wants. Whether they know it or not, they do. And so that's why you get this skewed version of events. They've also romanticized a lot of these journalists and anchors. They have, because they're allowed to, they have romanticized the jihadists. They really, really have. And it's utterly shocking. I mean, 15 years ago, in the past 15 years, Al-Qaeda has been invoked repeatedly to justify bombing countries, like everywhere, literally everywhere, for this global war on terror. But in Syria, it's the opposite.
And you say literally, because I mean, it is literally so. I mean, that was the authorization of the use of military force in 2001 was specifically targeted to Al-Qaeda. So it's literally the legal basis for the U.S. waging war worldwide.
Yes, exactly. But in Syria, it's the opposite. It's like in Syria, we're supposed to talk about these people like they are liberators and freedom fighters, despite the fact that Syrians don't even see them that way. And so now all of a sudden you've got people defending al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. You've got journalists, U.S. journalists, like lost their shit a couple months ago when the U.S. was like, we're considering bombing them. And they were like, no, it was so shocking. And then again, like, it's not that I support the U.S. government bombing people. It's just, it makes no sense. This reaction makes no sense. And beyond that, you know, with respect to this out with al-Qaeda in Syria, I would add that, like, this is going to backfire eventually. And it already is. There's attacks in Europe, you know, like all of these attacks, these ISIS attacks, these al-Qaeda attacks, these jihadist attacks that you see taking place. This can be directly attributed to the empowerment of these groups in Iraq and Syria. And the U.S. government has played a role in empowering these groups by supporting jihadists to topple the Syrian government. And there's so many parallels to Afghanistan in the 1980s. And, you know, I've been reading a lot of coverage, particularly from the New York Times back in the 1980s of what they called the Afghan rebels. It was like, I mean, it was the same exact rhetoric. It's like, arm the Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen are freedom fighters. Against the evil communists.
There's a clip that's there's like a screenshot of some newspaper article that's sort of become a meme where it's sort of a glowing profile of Osama bin Laden like smiling in the countryside or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, even as women were like in the refugee camps in Pakistan, like the USAID funded this program. It was like a secret program to send these jihadist textbooks to basically indoctrinate children in their Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. And we know about that now. We didn't know about that then. And that actually is what gave rise to the Taliban like 10 years later, that we ultimately ended up using to justify another war. But the point is,
let me just make a quick point because one reason, I mean, you've just laid out how the picture of the Syrian conflict that Americans are receiving is hopelessly skewed. And there are multiple reasons for that skewing. And one of them, I think, is the Russia hysteria that's been stoked domestically in the United States. That was obviously inflamed dramatically by the election and is persisting now after this, in the wake of this crisis over the so-called Russian hacking, which people, you know, millions of Americans now believe that Russia literally hacked the election. They can't quite define what hack the election means, but they think they know as fact that Putin directed some kind of campaign to throw the election to Trump. Okay, so if that's sort of the underlying political dynamic domestically, obviously that's going to skew perceptions of the Syria conflict, given that Russia's playing a role. So they're going to the least charitable interpretation of what Russia is doing and what what their role is the one that's going to be fed to American news consumers. And I think that's definitely a dynamic here, and it's the reason why I've been harping on this Russia fervor for so long, because it's not just about Russia itself and potentially leading to bridging the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and even, you know, prospectively leading to some kind of military conflict. It's because it has offshoot effects, one of which is people not getting a clear picture of what's going on in Syria.
And the reason I bring up the 1980s is because that backfired. That backfired because the U.S. joined with Saudi Arabia, and in the case of the 1980s, Pakistani intelligence, to spread an ideology of hate and to fund and arm a bunch of jihadists who are intolerant, who literally threw acid in women's faces. Like that is who we empowered in Afghanistan. And we remade that society. We destroyed that society. It was not a like ultra conservative, ultra religious society before we fucked it up. And we made it into that. And Syria, I mean, in Afghanistan, those people won because the Soviet Union fell. In Syria, and so the fight, like they won the fight and they ended up taking over. In Syria, the U.S. didn't win, but they still empowered these jihadists. And I would argue that they've empowered an even more committed generation of jihadists who are now like literally, I mean, this is what U.S. intelligence says, is they're plotting attacks against the U.S. And so my point is that we're in a time period in history, right, where you have a resurgent far right in both Europe and in the U.S. for a multitude of reasons. And the blowback that we're going to get, that we're already seeing in Europe because of its proximity to Syria, with jihadist attacks on like Western targets, it's going to eventually reach the U.S. And when it does, it's going to empower far-right demagogues that are on the rise here, just like it's empowering people in France, like Marine Le Pen, you know? And so, like, and I think that's something that nobody seems to be concerned about or understand, is that all these liberals who are like, we got to arm the rebels in Syria, we got to arm the rebels in Syria. It's like, do you understand, like, you are like sowing the seeds for future attacks on the US because you are arming jihadists. Like, and
here's what's sort of amazing. So they'll simultaneously advocate, I mean, these liberals will advocate for an intense campaign in Syria to arm the so-called rebels. So they'll depict it as as a humanitarian imperative, right? So every time they want to get involved militarily around the world, it's always for the purest of motives, and it never backfires because they're really, pure-hearted people. And that's always the case. But so they'll simultaneously advocate for that policy and for more lax immigration measures. Now, you can argue whether more lax immigration measures are warranted or unwarranted, or wise or unwise. But obviously, that's going to, increase the likelihood that a certain segment of the population are going to be more wary of people who you've empowered not so far away in Syria coming to Germany or coming to France or wherever. So there's like a paradox there that they don't seem to want to grapple with. Obviously, the situation in Europe is a little different than the U.S., but you could see a similar dynamic playing out here.
Yeah, no, totally. And I mean, I think Europe is much more vulnerable because like Europe is like close to Syria. They're right next to each other. It's like an easier access. The US, obviously, you've got this big ocean in between. But the point is like, we're spreading hate. That's what we're doing when we arm and fund jihadists. You are spreading a hateful ideology that hates minorities, that kills minorities, and that like does horrible things to women. And basically, unless you're a Salafi male, living under that kind of rule is not pleasant, and being around those people aren't pleasant. But yeah, you're gonna see, and like you've got these people are angry now because one of the reasons that Aleppo fell is because Turkey stopped helping the rebels there, led the way that they used to be, and so they lost access to their like weapons pipeline, if you will. And that is why they so quickly, I mean, they like, you'll notice it just like very quickly happened where like suddenly the rebels lost out of nowhere. It's because of it's because Russia got involved, but it's also because they lost their benefactor stopped helping them. And they're pissed off. Like, they're really pissed off. And they're going to aim that at the people that they're going to start at some point aiming that at the people that they think abandoned them. But they also already hate the U.S. Like, it's not like Al-Qaeda is suddenly going to start loving the U.S. They already hate the U.S. So this is going to come back to haunt. And that's what September 11th was. That's what 9/11 was. I mean, you can talk all you want. And I think that maybe it was actually a little inaccurate to say that people were responding to legitimate grievances of U.S. foreign policy. I'm not saying there aren't legitimate grievances. There are so many legitimate grievances to have against U.S. foreign policy. But you had people crashing airplanes, like civilian airliners, into towers and killing a shit ton of people. And it was like a huge cataclysm where like everything changed after 9/11, everything. It was used as an excuse to like demonize Muslims and to round them up, which is what the FBI did. It was used as an excuse to open up Guantanamo, which still exists now, this black site area in limbo where we just like hold people and torture them indefinitely. And it was used as an excuse to launch an endless war that is still ongoing. And beyond that, it's also curtailed our civil liberties. You have this vast spying mechanism that's in place because of 9/11. I mean, it has been used to justify so much repression on behalf, like, from the government, that that's what you're basically that's what's going to happen again. It's like, if you're going to empower people who are going to attack the U.S. and going to attack Western targets, then you're basically empowering the kinds of leaders in these countries who are willing to go even further. People like Donald Trump. Every time there's a terrorist attack, of some sort that's done by a jihadist, Donald Trump benefits. It's all of these right-wing demagogues who are demonizing Muslims and Arabs and refugees. They benefit. And the rest of us suffer.
And people suffer. Muslim Americans suffer, and Muslims, I guess, writ large suffer when you have cynical accuse you and others who lay out these criticisms of being Islamophobic, because they're reducing Islam to its most extreme elements. I mean, that's the thing that that was always objected to when right wingers in America and Europe do it.
Also, I want to be clear. Like, we have to stop acting like jihadists are these victims who are like all just like Muslims who went wrong. No, like they like this, like the Wahhabi like violent jihadist ideology. It's a tool of the U.S. and its partners in the Gulf states. It is not like some natural indigenous force of nature that just exists. It's like it's an indoctrination tool of the U.S. Like jihadists are used by the U.S. to fight adversaries like Russia. Like, they really are. It's like we need to stop thinking about, like, I really think that the whole analysis that particularly progressives on the left have of like violent jihadists needs to be updated and needs to evolve to something more than just they're reacting to mean U.S. foreign policies. They are a tool of the West.
And they are impelled in part, maybe even large part, by really retrograde fundamentalist religious belief, which a lot of people don't want to admit.
It would be like if you had, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent by Saudi Arabia spreading like its ideology, which is really hateful and really bigoted and like really eliminationist. If you had a similar amount of money being spent to spread this in any other, not just religion, but like just ethnicity, some sort of identity like this, trying to like spread and indoctrinate people the way that Saudi Arabia and its partners have done with Wahhabism, you would see something similar. Like, it's not like there's something inherently wrong with Islam or like these people are just like reading the Quran and going nuts, It's like this is being spread. It's like being spread. It's an ideology that is being spread across. It was spread in Afghanistan. It was spread in Pakistan. It's spread across the Middle East. And that's the thing, is you have to have a left analysis of this stuff, because what you have instead, if you don't, is far right demagogues being like using this argument of like, it's the Muslims, like the Muslims are all fucking crazy or something, or like Arabs are all crazy, and like they're all psycho, and then they'll just like show you some video of some crazy like cleric from Saudi Arabia saying something nuts. It's like,
I remember this. I remember having a similar reaction when ISIS first came on the scene in 2014, and the predominant reaction among liberals in the U.S. was to say, this isn't real Islam. This has nothing to do with Islam. Obama will come out and make similar overtures. And I always thought that was counterproductive, because it almost reeks of denialism. Like, and it shouldn't be seen as Islamophobic to identify that certain elements.
Well, it's like evangelical Christian
are invoking, theological tenets to justify.
I mean, the problem is that there's people who want to, and it's not just theological tenets. You've got clerics. You've got these clerics that just say crazy shit. Like, it's really, I'm being serious. Like, you've got these clerics that say crazy, crazy shit, and they've got millions of people who listen to what they say. You've got Saudi Arabia opening up these crazy mosques. Like, Saudi Arabia will open up these Wahhabi mosques in like places, like especially like you'll notice a lot of them exist. There was at one point where a lot of them existed around the countries that were formerly in the Soviet Union, that's sort of like satellite states that surround Russia. They try and weaponize like the Muslim populations in these areas by opening up mosques that end up just preaching hate to like a younger generation. I mean, you could do that anywhere. You could do it with anything. You could open up a bunch of churches in places and just preach pure, unadulterated hate, and it would change the population. It would. That would have an impact, even if just a few people, even if just like a few dozen people, you know, a few hundred people are encouraged. I mean, that's why you see all of these jihadists from like Chechnya and like Bulgaria and Albania, like in Syria. I mean, they're like, you know, they've got these like Wahhabi mosques that Saudi, or like these Islamic centers Saudi Arabia will build. And like it becomes like a recruitment tool and an indoctrination tool for, you know, that's why I say the jihadists, they really are a tool of the West, even if they don't know it. But that is what needs to be contended with. That, I mean, that's why because otherwise you end up with like people like Pamela Geller and like crazy people like Frank Gaffney being like the Muslim Brotherhood has infiltrated the White House, you know, and just like saying crazy, ridiculous, nutty shit that like makes no sense, or like Sharia laws.
Yeah, and I keep going back to this Russia stuff because now that Russia has been once again elevated as this great menace that we need to orient our foreign policy against, and we all need to be in hysterics about, it's going to be seen as justifying the empowerment of these jihadi elements because Russia and Putin supposedly supersede them in their potential to cause, you know, harm and evil. So that means it's okay to whatever arm a jihadi here and there and look the other way if Al Qaeda, you know, receives weaponry by way of the CIA. And I think that's why, you know, this hysteria has, like I said earlier, these offshoot effects and these ancillary effects where just 10 years, I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have any enemy supersede Al Qaeda in the eyes of, you know, the American political establishment. Doing anything that could be perceived in any way of abetting Al Qaeda would have just been beyond unacceptable. It wouldn't have never even been a thought in people's minds.
Well, yeah, you would be like getting material support. You'd end up in jail, like for material support.
Now that we've gone back, but now that we've gone back to demonizing Russia feverishly, you know, certain ends are going to be seen as justified to, you know, counteract that or whatever else. So that's a, you know, a harm that I see.
But even ISIS, like even ISIS, like the U.S. helped ISIS in Syria, and what I mean by that is like every time the Syrian army and its partners would be about to like defeat ISIS somewhere, or like would be fighting ISIS in one place, the U.S. and its allies would like flood rebels with all these weapons, and then suddenly there'd be an attack somewhere by like Al Qaeda led rebels, you know, and so the Syrian army would have to divert its resources to go fight Al Qaeda. And so then that lets ISIS get bigger in the area that it's taken over and like establish itself better in the area it's taken over and launch more attacks and take over more territory. So even if like just indirectly, the U.S. actually helped ISIS in Syria spread.
Yeah.
All to defeat Russia or whatever and like to overthrow some regime it doesn't like. It's fucking crazy.
I'm just curious, like, what was your personal security situation like? I mean, there's some specific precautions you might have to take. I mean, was there ever a moment of trepidation where you felt that something could go wrong, or I mean, were the areas you were in not necessarily susceptible to that? What was?
Oh, absolutely. Aleppo was terrifying. Every like 10, 15 minutes, mortars were being fired into the government-held area by our precious freedom fighters in the East Aleppo. And that's what people have been living under for like 5 years is just constant mortar shelling. And I almost got hit actually with a mortar I went to visit the humanitarian corridors the Russians and the Syrians had set up for people from East Aleppo to like evacuate into West Aleppo. And the humanitarian corridors were being shelled by the rebels. And so like that was a scary situation. It's also like you're in an authoritarian state. And that's never comfortable. It's very difficult to be a journalist in a war zone where this people in charge are a police state. So that was not comfortable whatsoever. And so like, I understand the hatred. Like I understand the deep resentment and hatred people have for the Syrian government. Like, the secret police are scary. They freaked me out. And I'm just like a journalist who was coming through, you know? I don't live there. So that, and they watch everything you do. And their propaganda is so bad. It's like embarrassing. Like, it's really, really, really bad. No, it's like kind of like no wonder they're losing in the like information war, because like their propaganda can't even compete with like the other side, but also it's just really bad. Like, some people in the government will just face palm because it's so
It must be bad, because would you ever know that Russia is involved in running a humanitarian evacuation zone for civilians who are, fleeing? No, you wouldn't. I mean, at least here you wouldn't.
No, and I mean, another thing like about, so like, I mean, despite how much they're like, they are a police state, that said, and this worked in some areas around Damascus, is they basically offered amnesty to fighters if they put down their weapons. Syrians, though, not foreign fighters. But if they put down their weapons, they can receive amnesty and like be reintegrated into society. And then those who don't and want to keep being rebels, they basically evacuated them when they would win in an area. They evacuated them, like fighters and their families, if they wanted to go to this area of Aleppo, or this area of Syria called Idlib. I mean, it's just like, could you imagine the U.S. doing that for ISIS? Just being like, okay, put down your weapons. We will give you amnesty. For those of you who don't want to put down your weapons, get in a bus and we will drive you to the area of your choice. I mean, that's kind of like... Is that offer seen as genuine, though, or is it just seen as like a... I mean, that's what they've done. That's what they've done. They've done that, like, in area. You don't know about this because no one hears about it, but this is what they've done. And I'm not trying to romanticize the government at all. The government really does suck. They're like a bureaucratic dictatorship, and they really do suck. Like, they made me feel paranoid. I got made fun of for like mentioning this on Twitter, but I mean, I think it's a little bit funny. When I was in Aleppo, I got really sick because I must have, like, the water there is just different, and I was brushing my teeth with it. I don't know. I also had like some ice in one of my Cokes. So I got really sick for a day. I was just like vomiting, like violently vomiting. And I was so paranoid from like just how suffocating the government can be there, that I was convinced, as I'm like vomiting, I'm like, they poisoned me. like, I mean, I know that's silly now, but that's like, I mean, the government, my point is I'm not trying to romanticize the government in any way. That said, they want this conflict to end too. They don't like this war. A lot of people in Syria have died. It's not pleasant for anybody. All sides have killed each other. The point is they want it to end, and this is something that has worked in some towns that have been taken back by the government that are around Damascus, that were held by rebel groups. It was, it was like, put down your weapons and we will reintegrate you into society, and you'll get amnesty. And some people chose that, and other people chose to keep fighting, and they were evacuated to an area held by rebels. Like, that actually happened. I mean, no one knows about this because it doesn't like get reported, but that has happened. And one of the issues in East Aleppo was they offered to do that. They said, put down your weapons, we'll give you amnesty. For those of you who don't put down your weapons, we're going to keep bombing you. That was like and you can argue whether that's good or bad, but basically those who put down their weapons, they evacuated them to Idlib, or to like parts of northwest of like northern Aleppo area. And those who didn't are like holed up in like a couple neighborhoods in East Aleppo. And apparently, from a report I saw today, from a guy who's on the ground there, he's like a very pro-jihadist guy, but he's on the ground there and he has all these updates on video. They've got suicide. They've got suicide belts on them, and they're like, we're either like, we're not going, they're not leaving without a fight. And those are like the hardest of them, like the most Al-Qaeda of Al-Qaeda, if you will. So that's what's been happening, but you don't get that. Like, you don't even know there's fighters. If you read US media, it's like there's no fighters in Aleppo. It's just all civilians only. And it's like, I mean, you could never imagine the US treating any population that way, where they're like, just put down your weapons and we will evacuate you. I mean, at all. And again, like, you can argue whether you agree with that or not, but it's just funny to see it from the same people who justify any bombing campaign that the US does, ever.
Yeah, and why is it that there's such a discrepancy in information that Americans are receiving? That's the theme I keep coming back to. I mean, I think one reason is that we have an entire industry in this country that is dedicated to the sending of armaments to foreign countries, So the allies in the media of those interests are going to want to propagate a certain narrative. The Russians are not really well represented as the lobbying force in Washington, so you don't get their point of view presented. That's why part of why they went out of the way to start RT, which is now dismissed as a propaganda organ, and maybe rightly so in certain respects. But the point being, you don't get their talking points issued to power players who are setting policy, or producers of TV stations who are putting together the Aleppo coverage of the day. And on top of that, now you have the Trump variable, where anything that is seen as favorable to Trump is frantically opposed by most people in the media. So if something happens in Syria which will seem to align with the narrative that Trump has been trying to put forward, meaning that we ought to be work in a collaborative fashion with Russia, and our priority should not be to depose Assad, that's now tarnished by association with Trump in the eyes of most of the media. So that's going to be downplayed and portrayed in the worst possible light. So you have this constellation of factors which kind of conspire to really misinform people about what's
and also
going on.
Don't forget the US has spent millions and millions of dollars funding a propaganda apparatus that then comes back full circle. So the West funds propaganda on Syria, and they fund it in a way where you end up thinking it's also authentic, stuff coming out of Syria, when in fact it's all coming out of Turkey, and it's being produced by PR firms. So then that propaganda is then fed into all these different in different ways to journalists, to U.S. journalists, because again, none of them are on the ground. They're all in Beirut, or in Istanbul. So it's fed to them. And so basically the U.S. produces propaganda, and then the U.S. media literally just regurgitates the propaganda produced by the U.S. So that's what you're seeing happen. It's great. It's actually brilliant. It's brilliant. The information war, it's really fascinating. A lot of the sourcing for what's happening in Syria has come from these media activists that were trained by state USAID funding, and their talking points are disseminated from Turkey, or the White Helmets, which is this rescue group that is funded entirely by the State Department and the UK Foreign Office. And so all of the information you're getting is coming from sources with a very serious, a very interventionist agenda, and it's being filtered.
And the White Helmets were the White Helmets were the source of so much of the initial information that came out in the immediate aftermath of the so-called recent siege of Aleppo, or fall of Aleppo.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all that stuff was sourced to White Helmets.
And they're called an independent rescue group that has no agenda. Literally, they'll be called that, or they have no opinion on intervention. And it's that's bullshit. They literally are funded by the U.S. and the U.K. It's an open known thing. They're not independent. You can take what they say and use it, but at least clarify what their agenda is. These are not independent actors. This is not some independent humanitarian group. Not only that, but there's all kinds of videos of online of the White Helmets, of people in them, not all of them, but people in them. They basically end up embedded with Nusra. They're waving Nusra flags. They celebrate when Nusra captures a place. They only operate in Nusra-held territories. It's not as though they're operating across Syria, or even across all rebel areas. And sometimes they have weapons. Sometimes they have weapons in videos. You can't be a rescue humanitarian person and have a weapon. You make yourself a target when you are. And that actually, I talked to humanitarian workers in Lebanon who were pretty pissed off about that. They're actually really pissed off to see these videos of the White Helmets running around with weapons, because under the laws of war, if you are holding a weapon and you're in a war zone, you can be considered a combatant, and you can be fired on. And so that puts all humanitarian workers at risk, especially in a place like Lebanon, because down the line, when Israel's bombing Lebanon next, all they need to do is point to, look at the time the White Helmets had weapons on them. So now these people are just like them.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Hillary campaign, I think, tweeted out some kind of praise of the White Helmets, or they, in some form, promoted their interests directly, I think. I mean, this was in Max Blumenthal had a good kind of expose of the white helmets a couple of months ago.
Yep.
So people should go read that for background.
I agree. But yeah,
So-
it's a brilliant strategy, and you're right. Like Russia doesn't have the propaganda apparatus that, let's say, Saudi Arabia has, or like
Or
all of these
Israel.
other states, or Israel or Qatar, at all. And then also you've got the U.S. also spending money on this propaganda. So yeah, you're at a loss. And this is not to make Russia out to be some like ultimate victim. They're not like a perfect player here. It's just to say it is much more complex than it is being presented. Far more complex. Like it's a completely different reality has been painted for for American consumption that is just not what's actually happening on the ground in Syria.
Yeah, and I think let's we should probably talk a little bit about the Electoral College, which is sort of tangential, but the Russia variable element. Well, I mean, it's amazing that you can kind of connect the dots between Syria and the Electoral College, and like the common denominator is Russia somehow. I mean, who would have thought, right?
Well, Russia's like, I mean, it's gonna be like that Obama. Remember, we saw would say they would always go thanks Obama, like to blame Obama for everything. You just say thanks Russia.
No,
I have like a new meme.
No, I've already been going with that.
Everything.
You're late to the party. I've been blaming Putin for all my pickup in my life.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see.
So,
wow, you're like a really committed American.
Yeah, I blame him for traffic. I blame him for acid reflux.
Yeah.
I'm going to blame him now because it's really cold in Scranton, Pennsylvania at the moment. So
yeah, it's cold here too, but I'm also kind of hot. The heater is way too hot here.
Okay, well, he must be responsible for that as well.
Yeah, totally.
But I was at the I was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania yesterday, where Republican electors gathered to formally cast their votes for Trump. And there's been this sort of loosely organized movement that seemed to draw equally from leftist activists, so not Hillary supporters, but the type of people you typically see at protests and that kind of thing, and dyed-in-the-wool Hillary supporters. So they were joining forces.
Oh dear.
I call them the Clinton loyalists, to protest at these Electoral College sites, or at least they did at the site that I was at, which was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the banner that they united under was Russia.
No.
Okay, so they were yes, they were. You should go look at my Twitter feed. I put photos, waving signs about Trump being Putin's puppet. Don't let Russia take over our government. Putin hacked the election. All variations of that theme, and they were at one point.
Like Trump's not bad enough on his own. You have to like make it about Russia because Trump's not bad enough on his own. You have to like. This makes no sense to me.
It was the main theme of the protest, Russia. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, there were some people who were focused on some other issues here and there, but if there was a uniting theme to the protest, it was that we can't let Russia subvert our electoral process by installing their puppet Trump. So that's what they're going with. It's a combination of leftists who don't necessarily have any affinity for Hillary, and the Clinton loyalist crowd who still have their I'm with her gear and we're wearing it.
I'm surprised leftists would be against Russia. That's bizarre.
I know, and I brought some of them, and they kind of here and there they'll concede the point, but I mean they're driven principally by opposition to Trump, and if Russia is the convenient cudgel to further that, they'll just go with it,
Because opposition to Trump should not be leading us to war. Those two things should not be together. Because that's what you're doing. If you're going to fearmonger about Russia, you're basically helping drum up war fervor against Russia.
And the point that I've been trying to make is that they render themselves ineffectual when they fixate on that.
Right.
If you want to be a coherent opposition force, and pretty counteract some of Trump's worst impulses, then obsessing about Russia is not the way to go about it. And in fact, it's just going to make you look fish, and it's going to distract from your ability to coherently and
also, it
rationally
plays into
oppose
like
Trump.
right wing fantasies, which maybe are not entirely fantasies about like what liberals think and believe, and it's just not a good argument. Like it's bullshit. It's literally like you are propagating fake news. So like I was obviously out of the country for a couple months, and I came back to this like fake news controversy as the same people who are pushing it are literally propagating fake news. Like it's the most insane, hilarious circus I've ever seen.
No, because the election produced an outcome they don't like. So every week they've been latching on to explanation for why Trump won. It was fake news, Russia, Comey, FBI, Jill
But we know it
Stein,
wasn't any of those
recount.
things. Even if Russia did hack our elections, even if they were responsible for the emails, the DNC emails being leaked, that's not why she lost. She lost because her campaign's stupid. Like they're idiots.
No, she lost. She lost because black voters. She lost because black voters in Milwaukee Sean Podesta emails and decided not to vote. Yeah, that sounds plausible.
That's exactly what happened. They were like, "Whoa, Podesta said what to who?" Like, I mean, it's just so absurd. Like the idea that somehow this is why she lost. And we know for a fact. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, for this John Podesta release and refreshing WikiLeaks, and decided not to vote for Hillary because they were so outraged by something that was in the emails. But I just wanted to make this point. Actually, I mentioned this on the Tucker Carlson show last night, which I was weirdly invited to appear on.
Did you have a mental breakdown?
But no, I know. I
you managed to make it in the room on like some people.
Thankfully, I did bring a binder just like with Tucker Carlson lives to show. By the way, Ike and Wall. This is not worry.
Dude, I didn't know who this guy was before the election. I got back to the U.S. and it's like this guy was having a mental breakdown. Everybody was talking about it. It was pretty funny.
I mean, it's like 20% funny, 80% sad.
You keep freezing on me.
But
I don't know what's wrong with the connection, but you keep freezing on me. You there? Can you hear me? Because you're just like a frozen.
I can hear you.
Screen. Frozen screen. Your voice keeps coming in and out.
Oh, I wonder if that means I'm frozen overall.
Well, now I can hear you, but I also have to we have to wrap up though because I got to get going because it's getting late.
Okay, yeah.
I can't stop yawning, and also I've got to get to bed soon.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, just to make it quick. So the most surreal moments I've ever experienced was at this protest yesterday in Harrisburg. There was a point where they all got together for a chant. And the chant was "No treason, no Trump. No treason, no Trump." So that's what the leftists and the Clinton loyalists were chanting over and over again as their way sort of. Yeah, so Trump committed treason somehow because Russia hacked the election. I mean, like they didn't really connect the dots very well, but that was the big theme.
Bad protest.
Yeah, and it didn't work. I thought they were going to get these party stalwarts who were Republican-like banded Trump. And of course, one of the greatest ironies is that more electors abandoned him than Trump.
Sorry. Keep yawning.
Okay.
But no, what I was gonna say is like, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to oppose Trump, but that is really disturbing that that if anybody who calls himself a leftist is just like joining in the anti-Russia hysteria. That's not a way to defeat Trump. It's not a way to like oppose the things about Trump that you don't like. The way to oppose Trump. I mean, I don't know the proper way to oppose Trump. I can't I'm not all knowing, but I just know that like drumming up, war fervor against Russia is bad for everyone. And also it's going to backfire because you're just playing into right-wing ideas about what liberals and leftists are. And like, this is a moment where like the people who are vulnerable to Trump's messages, like you have to, I'm not saying like that should be your primary target is reaching out to them, but you have to on some level be able to like to like have those people hear your narrative or some sort of, you have to have a counter narrative to Trump that works. And, you know, Russia hacked our elections, a really bad counter narrative, because it's just it screams fake news.
And that's going to be the so it skews the perceptions of the Syria conflict. It skews how people comport themselves in relation to Trump. It skews so much, and that's why it's so destructive. And that's why it's been one of the main things that I've been focusing on for the past couple months, and I think some others have as well. And it seems like for the foreseeable future, Russia is going to be the top theme. Even more. I mean, because there are going to be congressional investigations. Democrats can't stop talking about it. And so this is dominating the discussion around Trump. And I think the irony is that it'll ultimately empower Trump because, like I said, it's going to make his opposition look
stupid, weak, and full of shit. That's what it's going to do.
Yeah.
We got like Neera Tanden and Jeffrey Goldberg and David Frum. I think they're like leading the resistance to Trump. Like, what the fuck is this bullshit? I really don't. I wasn't paying so much attention.
Trump couldn't ask for a better opposition.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, it's like, God help us if that's our opposition to Trump, because we're fucked.
Yeah. Neera Tanden, who makes $300,000 a year leading a think tank, puts resist as her Twitter icon, and of course that's like in this sort of
smearing me as like an outside, like, dude, she's like supporting arming Al Qaeda. It's just fucking crazy. Like,
she spared you she spared you by trying to tie you to David Duke.
Yeah, like, because Tulsi Gabbard was like, we shouldn't arm Al Qaeda, and David Duke was like, right on, Tulsi, and she was like, no, I'm not on your side. You're a bigot. And then like Neera Tanden was like, wow, Tulsi Gabbard is like a David Duke loving Assadist. And then I like said something, and she was like, so are you? You're an Assadist, Rania. And like, it's like, what? So you don't want to arm Al Qaeda? That makes you an Assadist?
Neera did the same thing to me. So the person who could have very well been Hillary's chief of staff did the same thing to me when some random person on Twitter, I don't know, tweeted at her or me or something. I don't remember the exact genesis of it, but she used that as a basis to try to tie me to white supremacists. I mean, if Neera's the person who's leading that, if Neera's the person who's leading the resistance is going to get slaughtered.
Well, it just seems like it seems like people like Neera are more interested in pacifying and suppressing actual leftists than they are with defeating Trump. Like, than they are with like countering Trump. They just like want to keep stomping on Bernie Sanders and stomping on, it's like they think Hillary's still running or something. It's just so absurd. And they're just going to make
they're defending her legacy.
What?
They're more interested in preserving Hillary's reputation at this point. They want to admit that she did anything wrong.
Where the hell? She's a bad leader. She like isn't even like she like went underground.
She's out hiking, or like she hid. I mean, Bernie's out like making, talking to the people and promoting his ideals. Hillary went and hid, and like she showed her face at this party for multimillionaires in New York last week, but that's the last anybody's heard from her.
Those are her friends. She went to go see her friends, and then she went back. I'm glad Hillary. Look, as long as Hillary Clinton's, surviving, like it's like as if she's the ultimate victim here. Like the president's going to be Trump, and just shows what a shitty leader she is. That like she like ran underground, and then she came out to make a speech where she was like, "I'm okay. Don't worry, guys. I'm going to be okay. I was going to cry, but I'm not going to cry." And then also give Trump a chance. And the guy you've been calling him a fascist for the past like year, and warning us that you can't trust him with the nuclear codes, and now you're saying give him a chance. Like it just shows what all of these people are so full of shit.
They're incoherent. I mean, they've been incoherent for a long time with their Trump critique. But now what they're doing is, in order to preserve Hillary's reputation, they're denying that she legitimately lost the election. I mean, it's weeks now since the election, and they're still on this point. I mean, they're blaming Comey. I mean, they just started a new round of that today. They're blaming Russia. They're blaming all these other exogenous factors, and if they're continually in this mode of denialism, again, it's going to weaken.
They even blamed minorities, didn't they? Like,
I mean, they blame millennials. They blame everybody. I mean, there's nobody who hasn't been blamed at this point. I've even been blamed. No, they blame me.
I've been blamed several times, and I just want to say to all the people who blamed me, I did not realize I had so much influence over the American electorate.
I know.
I
I'm
had
so
no idea I was that influential.
I'm really impressed that my Medium post swung Wisconsin.
I know, like, I mean, I'm still kind of shocked that my tweets and my electronic intifada articles convinced so many people in Michigan to not show up for Hillary or to vote for Trump. I mean, I'm really shocked. Also, because I never advocated for Trump.
Yeah,
I mean,
you and I are really pulling the strings of power in this country. I mean, maybe we should probably make better use of that and exert our influence.
It's weird because I can't figure out how to do it again. Weird at all. Like, I don't know where the influence went. I've been trying to, like, I found out about it and I can't find it now. It's like no one's listening to me anymore.
Okay, so maybe we'll collude in some secret cabal at some point, and we'll get a new puppet and we'll install him into power.
Yeah, like a new white messiah, like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, white messiah, or maybe we'll even pick it. Maybe we'll even pick a minority messiah who is secretly into the white power structure somehow, subconsciously.
It almost sounds like that's been done. I don't know. That sounds like a familiar thing. But whatever. We should try it anyways.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this was a good conversation. Hope people found it illuminating.
Yeah, thanks for having with me. It's always fun.
Yeah, people will have enjoyed it, I'm sure. And let's go to sleep now.
Yep, we'll chat soon. Bye.
Okay, bye.